Thank you, Eunice. So good afternoon, everyone. Our speaker for this week's HIGI meeting is Stephen Reingold with the speech entitled Toronto the Great. Stephen has recently come to the conclusion that Toronto is great. He will share with us some of the stories he has heard or read recently that has caused him to conclude that Toronto is great. He has been a longtime Toastmaster and an auditor with the provincial government. So please, everybody, help me welcome Stephen.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you, Amin, for inviting me to speak tonight. For as far back as I can remember, everyone, Toronto was always known as Toronto the Good. I don't know why that was, but it was always Toronto the Good, Toronto the Good. But based on some of the things I've read, heard, and observed, just in the last 2 or 3 months, I'm not so sure the Toronto the Good moniker still applies. What do I think would be more appropriate? How about Toronto the Great? The purpose of my talk is to share with you just a sample of some of the things I've heard and read and observed recently that convinced me that Toronto is great. And this just happened recently. I knew Toronto was a nice city to live in. I've grown up here, but just recently I just concluded based on some of these things that Toronto's great. And I hope you find these stories interesting and hopefully they will convince you that Toronto's a great city too, if you're not already thinking along that line. The most profound story I heard that had the greatest impact on me was an emergency room doctor. I heard this on CBC one day. She had called in to tell about her experience. Following the big snowstorm we had in January, they say a record breaker, she couldn't get a car out of the driveway because of the snowplow. The snowplows left these huge banks. So apparently she called the Motor League and they told her, oh, it's going to be 8 hours at least. A police car drove by, just happened driving by, and they saw her trying to move the snow out of the way, and they saw she was wearing her emergency room garb. So they asked if they can assist. She said, well, I'm trying to get my car out so I can drive to the hospital. And they actually tried to help her shovel the snow, and they tried to push her car out of the way, and they just couldn't budge. And a fire truck actually came by, and they saw the police car and the policemen, and this woman like trying to push this car out of the way. And so they said, what's happening? She said, well, I'm late as it is trying to get to the hospital. They said, where are you going? She said, Scarborough General. They said, hop in. So I think one of the great things about Toronto is just people willing to pitch in and help out. Another thing that I think makes Toronto great is our cultural diversity. I think Toronto is believed to be, or I believe Toronto is, if not number one, it's certainly in the top 3 cities in the world in terms of multiculturalism. I think there's people from probably everywhere around the world that lives in Toronto. And I think this has had two implications. The first is that I think as a city that we tend to be very tolerant and very open-minded and tend to take other people's perspectives regardless of where they're from or who they're from. And I think that's really great. That's something I've noticed in Toronto that I haven't seen when I've traveled. And the second implication is we have probably the most ethnic restaurant neighborhoods in the world. We have Koreatown, Chinatown, 3 Chinatowns, Roncesvalles, Little Italy, I think Portugal, and Greektown on the Danforth. A New York Times travel editor actually described Toronto on a recent visit as a global gourmet city. That was in a New York Times article. So it's kind of interesting how someone from New York on a visit to Toronto would notice these things. Toronto, of course, another thing that makes Toronto great is safety. don't take my word for it. The Economist magazine, the Economist publication, every 2 years publishes a Safe Cities Index. Toronto last year ranked number 2. Number 1, if you're curious, is Singapore, but Toronto was number 2. And they looked at some 57 indicators of urban safety, personal health, infrastructure, digital and environmental safety and security. Based on all those factors, Toronto ranked number 2. And 2 years before that, we were in the top 10 as well. And 2 years before that, we were like ranked number 4th in the world in overall safety. So that's pretty amazing. I think another thing that makes Toronto great is sports. We're the only city in Canada and one of few in North America that have all the major sports teams: basketball, hockey, football, baseball, lacrosse, you name it. Toronto has it all. I think on a personal note, what makes Toronto great is its accessibility. You see, in 1976, I became legally blind. So I know that Toronto's just really great in terms of accessibility. There's at least three things that Toronto's done that's far ahead of other cities. Number one, we have those, you probably noticed the bumps before you reach the street on the sidewalks. Those are there for people who have canes, white canes, like myself. So it tells me when I'm approaching a curb. We also have audible street signals. I never even knew this until I was on a mobility lesson with the CNIB, Canadian National Institute for the Blind, a few years ago. And they were telling me, you push and hold a button, I think it's for 3 or 4 seconds, you hear like 2 clicks, and that triggers a different signal, an audible signal. You sometimes may hear the chirp, chirp, or something like that when you're crossing the street. That's the audible alarm, and they were put in there for sight impaired people. And number 3 is our transit is probably, and I haven't been to every transit system in the world, but I've been to Montreal, which is pretty modern, New York City's subway system, which is pretty old, but none of them have, at least the last time I was there, no escalators, no elevators. I mean, nothing. It's just the way they were built 50, 60, in case of New York, 100 years ago. Whereas Toronto has elevator at almost every stop. We certainly have escalators at every stop. So just based on these five factors, I have to conclude that Toronto is great.